is here. He went to Austin Peay, and he, at the University in Clarksville. He's worked for the better part of 2 decades in the public history. He's known as a cultural historian. He's at Carnton Plantation, the Hermitage, and at Travelers Rest, where he was a curator. He has a graphic arts background and currently freelance works in illustration and design. He's also worked in film and television and was featured on the History Channel's series America's Sweet Slang, as well as the American Heroes Channel, Blood and Fury. In addition, he was head writer on the script for Wide Awake Films documentary, Franklin, 5 Hours in the Valley of Death, which won a regional Emmy. He is the author of the book Murder and Mayhem in Nashville, and released from History Press in 2016, and he lives in Nashville, Tennessee. And actually, we found him last year when we were here at the Spring Fest, and he was doing books right across the street over there in front of the old bank building. And so we stopped and talked to him, and what really struck us was his enthusiasm for his topics. He was so interested. Now, the book I have is Notorious Nashville.
Yes, that's the new one.
And it has just little snippets, and you know, you can sit down and read just a little short story about notorious things that went on in Nashville. So, and I've already given your bio. Now, on the 20th, he's going to be at Wynwood, doing the etiquette of dueling. So, and are you going to appear in the Southern Festival of Books?
I am. I'm actually on a panel on Sunday morning, well, Sunday noon when it opens. So that I think that's in the main library. Yeah, I'll have to look because there's like 4 of us on the panel and we're all playing tag right now on email. But last I heard, it was supposed to be in the special collections room upstairs in the library.
And you were at Wynwood this past summer?
I was.
Okay.
And I'll be there again if anybody's on that bus tour. I think they got me telling ghost stories this Friday. So it's been a busy month.
Yeah,
so.
it has. This is Brian Alison.
All right. Thank you so much. Wonderful. I do apologize immensely. As I was saying, it's 45 minutes from my house. I was there for an hour and a half. There were about 5 wrecks between here and downtown, so it's a good way to maybe kill an hour and let that cool down, and we'll talk about something a little bit more humanly paced. We're going to be talking tonight a little bit about horse racing in Sumner County. Now, I came by this subject kind of roundabout way. It's not something I'll be honest, that I was very interested in for the longest time. It was something that goes with the territory. If you are a historian like me and you're dealing with the antebellum period, horse racing is just part of the package. And working at the Hermitage, like I did, we were constantly about Jackson and his horse racing, It wasn't until we started working up a program on horse racing that we realized how all-encompassing that subject was to Andrew Jackson and to gentlemen of his same ilk. It's like football today. You wanted to talk to them about something and there was nothing else you could do, start on the horses and they were off and running. And it was just something that they lived and breathed, just like major sports today. What was really interesting was to see how much the subject was connected to this part of the country as well. Because Sumner County, I don't think it's exaggerating to say, Tennessee before the Civil War was the heart of horse racing in the South. But Sumner County was the heart of horse racing in Tennessee. And this really was a leading area for breeding and creating winning animals. So at one point, this county obviously had a national reputation. And we're going to get into some of this. I don't have a lot of time tonight, and you don't want to be here for 3 or 4 hours while we just talk about every little detail about this. But what I'm going to concentrate on are some of the fun stories, some of the more interesting things that have come up about this, and hopefully, like me, you'll find that it's a more interesting subject than it appears on the surface. It's not just boys playing with toys, although there is a lot of that as well. Well, we're going to be starting off with, the obvious. This is what you think of when you think of horse racing today. And were it not for an act of the State Assembly in 1906, we might still be seeing this today. Churchill Downs, the Kentucky Derby, of course that's the heart of horse racing in America today. At one point though, Nashville and its surrounding area was almost on this same circuit. One of the little tidbits I love to point out, if you're in Nashville and you go down there to the state fairgrounds, At one point, there was a grandstand that looked almost exactly like this. And into the 1960s, people would sit there and watch stock car races in these big, beautiful Victorian grandstands. It was supposed to be part of the circuit. It was supposed to be the Cumberland Downs, Kentucky Downs, Saratoga, Preakness, all that was supposed to be on the same national kind of circuit. And there was a group of national investors and farmers that were very interested in getting that off the ground. And then the state legislature, in a fit of zeal and reform, passed an anti-betting law in 1906, the first of many such blows that Vice got in this area. But that killed the horse racing, the breeding industry in Tennessee pretty much overnight. It would hang in there until after World War II, but that's why we ended up with one of the nicest stock car grandstands in America, and it burned in a fire in the 1960s, so there's nothing left of it today. But all of this was supposed to be part of this same gentleman's circle around the United States. And gentlemen, it was. This is what we're talking about here. Sumner County, beautiful horse country as it is. This is where horse racing was born in this state. Almost from the first days. Now, again, going back on this, few terms and what have you, we're talking about organized horse racing. We're talking about thoroughbreds. We're talking about the real deal there. Horse racing has been around since Jamestown in this country, but it always was kind of a different matter than what you see today, like at Pimlico or Kentucky or Churchill Downs. That's what you think of when you think of horse racing in Tennessee at first. And in fact, this is something that a lot of the settlers brought with them back over the mountains from Virginia and what have you. We're talking quarter horse racing. Now that was universal. Everybody raced quarter horses in the early days from the beginning, but they weren't organized races. These were broken country, cross-country grudge matches. Literally a case of, mine's better than yours, oh yeah, prove it. And then they get on the horse and ride up to the middle, and then whoever wants in on the race and thinks they've got a fast horse and they get in there. And it's just as rough and tumble as this old painting from California suggests. Usually the horse owner is the rider in a case like that. There is no pre-planning of any of this. It's usually on the spot, and the bets are all laid, and they just take off cross country. And broken bones and damaged animals are usually the case. That was the world that they brought with them over the mountains into eastern Tennessee when this place was first being founded. And like I said, it's a rough and tumble world we're talking about there. The quarter horses, by the way, are all part of the breeds and everything. I'm not going to get into all that, but of course the quarter horse called that because these races usually last only a quarter mile. And that's because they're really good on speed, sprinting. They're not so good on stamina, bottom, as they call it. So what we're looking at here is the transition from this into what we know of as a horse race today, and that would be the thoroughbred. Thoroughbreds, of course, again, this is all new to me and I'm no expert, but as I understand it, there's about 3 pure-blood horses that were brought here from England, and all thoroughbreds in America have to trace their lineage back to those 3 particular horses. So this was definitely a rich boy's sport, and a key to being a gentleman in those days. And that's all tied to this as well. Because when somebody like Andrew Jackson comes across the mountain, this was his world when he was growing up. One of the first things he ever purchased when he got to be a new lawyer, newly minted back in Jonesboro, Tennessee, or not in Jonesboro, back in North Carolina, he purchased a quarter horse, took it to the next town over, and nearly lost it again. Because he put it up for stakes in a game of rattle and snap. And they said that at the last throw of the dice, Jackson won the game and managed to keep the horse. He used to be fond of telling his nephew, you must risk to win. And risk he did. But that's not a gentleman's sport. That's young rowdies doing that. What he wanted to get in on, what everybody wanted to get in on, was the thoroughbreds. That was what gentlemen did. And that's the province of people way back on the coasts of Virginia and the Carolinas. Those were where the American thoroughbreds started. And they were pretty penny, as you can imagine. So getting involved in this, going from the quarter horses into the thoroughbred breeding, that's a built-in path to being a gentleman in this part of the world. Something like somebody like Andrew Jackson would be very impressed with. That's a thoroughbred, by the way. This is one that Jackson later purchased in life. This is Bolivia. And you can see they were inordinately proud of their horses, and there's some lovely paintings online you can find. They oftentimes have these things painted, and then the groom is out of the way and hiding his face or something in the back right there because the object is to show off the animal. But this was a big transitional step for people like Jackson to go from those rough and tumble lawyers back east into something a little bit more polished, which is what they were trying to do all along. And where does Sumner County come into this? Well, Sumner County is the site of the very first of these races. It literally was born here. Starts with a fellow named Redmond Dillon Barry, who I absolutely love, not just because his name is the same as the main character in Barry Lyndon. And just like the guy in Barry Lyndon, he was an Irishman, came over here. In fact, ironically, he was a friend of Andrew Jackson's, Barry was. He was also a childhood playmate of Sir Edward Michael Pakenham, who was the general Jackson killed at New Orleans in 1815 in the battle there. So, I mean, you're talking about a man with connections when he came here. He's the one who brought supposedly the very first thoroughbred into Tennessee, at least in the middle part of the state. And that was a mare named Gray Medley, who was brought in 1802. In the fall of 1804, he decided to test it out against some of the local stock, so he organized the first horse race in Tennessee. In fact, the track is, there's the track, I can't see without the glasses, but if I'm remembering it right there, that is, what is that? Northwater, right there. Over here is Blythe on that side. Here's the railroad depot, and that's where the grandstand was erected. So right there in downtown Gallatin, in what's a very heavily built-up area today, that was where the first racetrack in Tennessee was ever organized. That's what's going to put this apart from that broken country quarter horse racing, because they actually laid out a mile-long track, graded it, made it nice and smooth and level for the animals, and then it was 1 mile in length, and then you'd have those heats. They would go 2 miles, 4 miles, however many laps around the track that they needed to do. Usually there was a half-mile post on one side and then the mile post there, and that's everybody just whooping and hollering and watching these guys go by. This was the first time this has ever happened in Tennessee, and it brought all the bigwigs out from Sumner and from Davidson County, and this was also the birth of a long-standing rivalry between the two counties, as a matter of fact. One of the horses entered into this race. Now, Gray Medley didn't race that day, but General William Hall brought one of the daughters, I guess to say, the offspring of Gray Medley, called Polly Medley, a little gray mare that was brought in, named for his wife, Polly, who had just married, and she was prominent among the spectators. So was Andrew Jackson and his wife, Rachel, had come out from his newly purchased Hermitage. He just bought it that year. And he brought with him a horse that he was betting heavily on named the Indian Queen. That's an interesting aspect of all this. There's not a lot of co-ed entertainment on the frontier. But as rough and tumble as these things would be with all the betting, there's usually gamblers down by the gates throwing beans and cards and dice. There's all sorts of people, black and white, enslaved, free, everybody gathering at the track there. And the women are taking a huge part in this as well. It was one of those very few, as rough as it was, very few co-ed kind of things that you could do on the frontier and still be respectable. One quote, we love using that in that program at the Hermitage that one of our researchers found. She loved it. It was from a fellow who was in Kentucky watching a horse race. He said, never, and listening to the ladies cheer their favorite horse on, he said, never before or since have I heard the entire compass of the female voice. But that's how this crowd sounded when these guys were going. So there's Andrew, by the way, a few years after this happened. This is in probably around 1815. So he was still a relatively young man when all this was going on. And of course, Rachel came with him. Rachel was apparently, I guess in today's parlance, smack-talking the local horse. She was backing her husband's horse to the hilt, obviously, and she commented out loud that the little mare, Polly's Medley, was too small to take on the Indian Queen. Couldn't possibly run with it. Well, Polly Hall, the general's wife, was standing nearby, and she was 17, and she was of small stature herself, and rather tartly she responded, horses are like people, the smallest are generally the smartest. So as you can say, there's a little bit of friction already on the backs. Well, as they said, the Sumner County ladies put their last glove, as one writer put it, behind Polly Medley, whereas the Davidson County ladies and Mrs. Jackson put theirs behind the Indian Queen, the drum beat, and off they went. It usually starts with a drum. That was an interesting detail we found from that era. There's the drummer here in this little print. So it wasn't a gunshot or a horn like they do today. It was that way. So once the drum tapped, they were off. Just so happened, just to give you an idea of what exciting thing this must have been, just so happened there was a preacher. Nobody named him, but he happened to have been at the track that day. And he said he was looking for a lost cow. But he managed to stick around to watch the race, climbed up into a tree, and as Polly started pulling ahead of the Indian Queen, he shouted out, "Look at Polly Medley, she leaves a damn blue streak behind her." He was later censured by his church and actually suspended from the pulpit for a few months for his enthusiasm for the wilder things of life. So as it turns out, when they crossed the finish line, there was no doubt about it. The thoroughbred won out. Indian Queen was left in the dust. Polly Medley won. Sumner County took the first laurels at this race. However, Jackson was typically Jackson. He wasn't going to let that stop him. In fact, he was bitten by the bug, as one person put it. And this is where he jumps into it full force at this point. He's exceedingly lucky, too. If you go down near the Hermitage, this is a Coles and a Target now. I think the Coles is over here, the Target is here, the driveway runs between, but this is actually the site of the Clover Bottom Racetrack. That was his first venture into it big time. Sumner County's was the very first track, but literally within a year, you start seeing them popping up in Nashville, in Sumner County, up near Clarksville, everywhere. Everyone's getting into this because that one race put the word out. You know, basically, we're in the big leagues now. Now we can afford thoroughbreds. Let's get into this. So Jackson puts his own racetrack in right near the Hermitage where he can stage manage everything. And that same year, 1805, he purchased a horse race named Truxton from Virginia. And Truxton had a spectacular career. He was exceedingly lucky. I think he paid $1,000 for the horse, which is a small fortune in those days. Horse only ran 2 years. He came up lame after Jackson ran him too hard. He was hard on horses, Jackson was. But in that 2 years before he was put out to stud, Jackson used to brag that the horse brought in $20,000 in winnings. You can imagine why these people were so enamored of this sport. Inadvertently, too, though, Truxton, one of the races with Truxton also got him into a dispute that led to a fight with Charles Dickinson, that led to a duel that nearly got him killed in 1806. So you can say it was an incredibly important milestone in Jackson's life getting into this. But that's the thing is, Jackson was like that. He was competitive, he was ruthless, he hated to lose, and he was the kind that couldn't let something go. And one of his biggest battles that he ever fought was fought right here in Sumner County. Well, actually it starts right here in Sumner County. Most of it was played out in Davidson. But the heroes at the beginning of this are Sumner County first, last, and always. And they're some of the most unlikely heroes you're ever going to hear about. There was a Captain Jesse Haney, who was one of the big horse breeders in Sumner County in those days. And in 1809, he purchased a year-old mare named Mariah from North Carolina. And of course, with the name, there's a lot of Mariahs out there, so they named it, they started calling it Haney's Mariah, and that's how she comes down to us today. We know she was dark chestnut, she was 15 hands high, very small. She was a descendant of Diomed, one of the great racing horses of all time from Virginia. And she was unusually fast. In fact, people for decades after this, if you read accounts of this thing, they're at a hard pitch to try to explain exactly what made this the perfect mix in this animal. But she was going to have an incredible run of luck in the next few years. Part of that success was the man who rode her, and he deserves some mention too. Too many times when you talk about the story, you talk about horse racing and everything, you're talking about the owners of the horse. And as hands-on as that are, Jackson and Jesse Haney and George Eliot and all these big breeders, they were just that. They were the guys on top. They took the credit. But the hard work was done at the bottoms by the stable boys, the grooms, the horse trainers, the jockeys. And oftentimes in those days, before the sport became very much segregated in the 1890s and 1900s, those faces were African American and oftentimes enslaved. So they don't often get their due, they don't often get mentioned. And that's why Mariah's story is so unusual, because the jockey is pure in front and center in this case. And he has a very unusual story to tell. His name was just Simon. We don't have a portrait of Simon. I've just picked this one from the background of one of the portraits to illustrate one of the unsung heroes. But Simon is, he's deserving of a lot more credit than a lot of people give him today, or a lot more knowledge, I should say. He should be known better. Simon was born in Africa, apparently, brought to this country as a young boy, enslaved. Rumor has it he was a prince in his homeland. There's no way to prove or disprove that at this point in time, but he certainly acted like a prince on and off the track. Simon was remarkably astute, knew how to market himself, even within the bounds of slavery, and he had an unusual disadvantage that would tend to him, that he would turn to his advantage, I should say. Simon was severely deformed. The estimate was he was only but 4 foot 11 inches tall at his full height. He was completely stooped over. They call him a hunchback in early accounts of him. Very long arms and in proportion to his body. So not a fellow who would have lasted very long in the fields. Put him on a horse, on the other hand, he learned to ride like the wind, and he also learned to play the sport to the hilt. He became one of the most celebrated jockeys of his day, and he had a mouth to prove it. And this is what I love about Simon is he could get away with murder. He literally was that valued within that society. This society that does not look at slaves twice. This man could talk back to Andrew Jackson himself and get away with it. It's all part of the act with him. And he manages to push it just far enough without getting himself into serious trouble. For example, just to show you how rough and tumble this sport could be. On one occasion, Jackson was dressing down the jockeys before a race, and Simon was standing there, and he said to him, he said, I don't want to see any of those tricks that you did last time. He said, no spitting tobacco juice in my horse or my rider's eyes this time around. That'll show you how close to the wire these guys played it. They said Simon pulled himself up and looked at Jackson, towered over him, not intimidated in the least. He said, well, General, he said, I've ridden against your men on many an occasion. He said, I don't recall one of them ever coming close enough to catch my spit. And again, that was it. Jackson would curse and move on. So, I mean, he had a way of getting away with murder because he was so skilled in the saddle, and he was going to be an unbeatable team when you put him on this horse. It starts out the fall of 1811 at the Nashville race course. Again, a lot of lost race courses today. If you know downtown Nashville, here's where the drama played out. That's the baseball field today. And somewhere in that approximate area was the Nashville race course from about 1806 to about 1822 or so. And this is where these matches were going to be fought out. Starts out in 1811 where she beat all comers in 2-mile heats at the Nashville course, including General Jackson's colt Decatur. Now Decatur was kind of a pride thing for him. Decatur was the son of Truxton, his favorite. And this horse beat him straight out the gate. So, as you can imagine, Jackson is not one to let things go, and he was determined to beat Hades Mariah the second time around. So the following year, he didn't actually have a horse in the race, but Colonel Ed Bradley brought a horse down from Virginia called Dungannon. And this time, it really does become a grudge match. Mrs. Jackson and her niece Rachel Hayes led all the Davidson County ladies again, betting on Dungannon. And the Sumner ladies, led by Colonel Anthony Bledsoe's daughter Clarissa, put everything behind Mariah. And at the end of the day, you bet it, Hayes Mariah had beaten him twice. Jackson comes a little unhinged, actually, at this point. I mean, he's seeing red at this point. It's quite obvious in his letter. He starts scouring the South for a horse to beat Mariah. Price, no option. He actually just says this to any horse breeder. He goes finally to Virginia, Colonel William Johnson up there, and Johnson's no fool. He sees him coming. He says, well, I've got Pacolette. She's supposed to be the best 4-miler in Virginia. Give it to her for $4,000. 4 times what he paid for Truxton. No questions asked. He puts the money down. He brings the horse to Nashville. The 1813 race was a repeat of the next one. Now Jackson's got his beloved Pacolette in there. Mariah's up against her, and once again, Mariah beats everything that's coming at her. In 2-mile heats, in 4-mile heats, one-on-one matches, leading the pack, doesn't matter. She walks away from every race. Jackson he took it badly. And this is why I admire Simon so much. Jackson had a temper, as you can see from some of the contemporary propaganda about him. In this particular case, he was so angry, they said, he was practically spitting, and his friends were afraid to walk up to him and talk to him. Not Simon. Oh no, Simon walked up to him and said, "General, you've always been ugly, but now you're a sight." He said, "I'd like to put you in a cage and display you to people and charge them money." He said, "Of course, I'd have to put the cage out there so you wouldn't bite them." There's no record of how Jackson reacted or what he said, but I bet you Simon scurried away real quick. He was pushing it close to the line that time. But as you can imagine here, again, this is Jackson at his best, showing exactly how difficult it was for him to let something go, even when it was a good idea. In 1814, Jackson was away on campaign. He was down fighting the Creek and the British. He still managed to purchase Tam O'Shanter from a South Carolina breeder, bring him into Nashville, and was probably beaten again by Mariah at the fall races that year. The story goes, in fact, we found this quote fascinating when you're doing this. There's actually a letter from Jackson to General John Coffee. He wrote it maybe a week or so before the British landed at New Orleans, and he's going over, the news of the day and what he wants to, and he says in the letter, and underlines this, right toward the end of the letter, he said, "I see from the Nashville papers that the celebrated Pacolet beat the noted mare so-and-so with great ease," and he underlines this. Then the very next line is, "Oh, prepare to have your brigade ready to march, the British are coming and we don't ready." He literally, that's almost like an afterthought at the end of the letter. So in this, he's literally thinking, okay, how am I going to beat this horse? And finally it sounded like Pacolet actually paid for herself when she beat this other horse. So he's still hacking away even while he's fighting the British. And sure enough, as soon as the war is over in 1815, he comes back ready for one more fight. This time he keeps it quiet. He goes up to Kentucky and he has a semi-legendary mare brought to Tennessee, along with her owner, a Mr. DeWitt. This horse doesn't even have a name, apparently. They just call it DeWitt's mare. But it has a statewide reputation in Kentucky and over in Virginia that it can beat anything that's coming at it. So Jackson literally brings a ringer in this time and keeps it quiet. And more than that, he also brings in a rider for it. He goes to Virginia and he finds an enslaved jockey named Dick, who's supposed to be the best thing around. He brings him down. So, I mean, he literally, this is a team effort. He's got people in 4 or 5 states getting in together, bringing horses and riders in just to beat Haney's Mariah in 1815. Dick is also kind of an interesting character, too, because he also shows about how these guys, just like today, a good athlete, try to psych out your rival. He found out Simon's weakness, other than his physical disability. Simon was rather superstitious, and he believed in signs and portents. So Dick let it be known that he was a soothsayer. He could see the future, and he'd seen it plain as day. He said, "If that nose of your horse passes mine, anywhere before we pass the last half-mile mark, you'll be thrown to your death, your neck will be broken, you'll be killed. I saw it in a dream." Simon believes it, which is what makes this such a wonderful nail-biter of a race, what happened next. Simon, when the drum beats, holds back. I mean, everybody's whooping and hollering and everything. The Sumner County people have put everything on Mariah. A lot is riding on this, reputation, everything. And yet, DeWitt's mare pulls ahead and Simon holds back. And sure enough, every time he seems like he's about to go forward, he hauls back. And it goes around that way the first half-mile mark. That's how they are. Just one nose behind, all the way around the mile mark. By this point, the Sumner County crew is screaming. They literally are hopping up and down, throwing their hats on the ground and screaming, "Give the steel to her, give the spurs to her, let her out!" Simon doesn't do it. He keeps holding back. He keeps holding back. Finally, last half-mile mark, they hit it. And that's when Simon winks and gives her the spur and moves. And in the last half mile, this celebrated racer from Kentucky that had come down there, Simon manages to distance her on the back of Mariah. What that means is, in that last half mile, by the time he actually passed the finish line, he was 270 yards ahead of the horse, maybe more. That fast. It was like she was standing still. Now, someone else, a little more sane, might have given up before this, but even Henry Jackson at this point sees the writing on the wall. It was said after the race was over, some Virginians were in the crowd, and they came up and started, of course, challenging the winner, Haney's Mariah, and they told Haney that he ought to bring him up to Virginia and race a real horse. He talks right back and says, I'll match her against any horse in the world for $5,000. Bring him on. Well, Jackson's settling up with him at the end of the day, and they're discussing this back and forth. By the way, they can fight like this on the thing, and it's like sports should be. They're just friends at the end of the day, but, you know, a lot of ego riding on it, basically. So Jackson's over there being friendly and settling up the bets and whatever, the markers. And Haney mentions this little challenge he got from the Virginians. Jackson's response was, make the race for $50,000 and consider me in with you. She can beat any animal in God's whole creation. Incidentally, this may be the only time we have on record where Andrew Jackson admitted he lost. Years later, one of his good friends, Bailey Peyton, we're going to hear a little bit about him in a minute. Peyton loved talking horse racing. Thank God Peyton wrote it down, because we have several articles about him, about the old-time turf races and everything the stories he swapped with Andrew Jackson. A few weeks before he died, he was sitting with Jackson at the Hermitage. He said, General, he said, was there anything you ever set out to do that you weren't able to accomplish? And Jackson said, no. Except Haney's Mariah. I was never able to beat that horse. And that literally, a few weeks before he died, he still couldn't let it go. And he never lived it down. But the only thing that ever beat Andrew Jackson, and that was how Peyton used to say it, he said he beat the Banks, he beat John Quincy Adams, he beat John C. Calhoun, he beat the British, he beat everything. He could never beat a little 15-hand mare from Sumner County, Tennessee. So there's more than a little local pride among these guys when you're talking about this. Mariah goes on to have an incredible 9-year career. She lost her first race in her 9th year on the track. And soon after that, she was lame. She was sold to a South Carolina fellow who didn't take care of her as well, and she falls out of the racing circuit. Unusually, we actually know what happened to Simon. I hesitate to say the nickname because you'll see it if you look him up. He's fascinating, but he had an unfortunate nickname. They called him Monkey Simon, and I don't like using it because it's such a nasty thing to say. However, he actually made the papers when he died. In 1836, the cholera hit Nashville. And rather unusually, in the list of mortalities for the day, they list everybody down, and then there's a separate line that says, Simon, the celebrated horse jockey, also died of the illness last week. And they gave his estimated age, I forget exactly how old it was, but around 50 years old or so. So we actually do know what happened to him, start to finish. Simon's a fascinating character, and he's a reminder that not all the heroes were on the up in the grandstands. His story, I think, deserves to be a little better known. Now, Sumner County continued on with its horse racing. This is the great Bailey Peyton right here, one of the greatest horse breeders in the state. He was a senator. He was, you know him. I mean, he's got things named after him over here. But what he's best remembered for in this industry is just a reminder of how powerful this county once was in this sport. And that takes place in 1839 when Peyton puts the word out that he expects to have a race in 4 years' time. Any horses foaled within this year of 1839 can be entered into it by anybody at any time. That's the only stipulation. They have to be 4 years old and they have to be foaled in 1839. It becomes known as the Peyton Stakes. And it's once again to be held at Nashville. 4-mile heats, 30 subscribers, $5,000 each $1,000 forfeit. This is going to be heavy betting. They knew that from the beginning on this. And a lot of these guys go in and start betting early and betting often. When it comes down to the actual day, October 10th, 1843, as you can imagine, the stands were packed for this thing. The word had been going out for 4 years about this race. There were only 4 starters in the race. Only 4 finally made it to the final races. There was Skylark, owned by Alex Barrow, ridden by John Ford. The Great Western, owned by Bailey Peyton, the local horse, and ridden by Monk, who was apparently enslaved. And then there's Glumdalladitch. You gotta love these names. They don't get any less strange as the years go on. If you think some of the ones at the Kentucky Derby today are odd, you should see some of the ones they put back then. So Glumdalladitch, who was also known as the Glencoe filly, owned by Thomas Kirkman and ridden by F.P. Palmer, or who is better known as Barney for some reason, who was actually a New England jockey and brought in here to do this. And then there's Harold, owned by Wade Hampton, who also owned most of South Carolina, it seems, and was ridden by Sandy, an enslaved jockey brought in especially for the race. So as you can imagine, this is the royalty of the South coming together for this thing at a time when cotton was booming and the money was flowing freely. What happened was going to be spectacular. Here's the scene of the crime, so to speak, the Burns Island Racetrack. It's today just an industrial area right on the Cumberland River down in Nashville. But for years, from the 1820s up until the 1880s, this was where horse racing was held in the city. So this was the third race course we had down there. There was an eyewitness who remember what I said about the ladies earlier? An eyewitness was there that day, and I cannot beat the way he described that final run by these 4 horses. He said basically Glendalladitch apparently was holding back all the way around this thing, the Glencoe filly. And they call her that because she's a daughter of Glencoe, a very famous horse from actually North Carolina by way of Alabama. It says, the run home was made amidst the most profound silence, which was broken only when the Glencoe passed Herald. I thought I had heard some little noise in Kentucky on such occasions, but this did indeed out-Herod Herod. You have not yet heard a good old-fashioned Tennessee yell. You ought to have your measure taken for one and have it shipped by first conveyance. Apparently the crowd went, wow, this is Glencoe, the mother of Glendalladitch, who ended up walking off with the entire thing, beating the others, and once she passed Harold, it was in the bag at that point. So Thomas Kirkman wins this Peyton Stakes and pocketed a grand total of $46,000 in 1841 dollars. This is the wealthiest one winner stake ever in history, Europe or America, until this point. And it's a record that won't be broken for 11 years. People were talking about the Peyton Stakes for years to come. If you go down and see the Burns Island track historic sign, it mentions the Peyton Stakes were run here. So much so that Glendalladitch mercifully got a new name. Kirkman renamed her Peytona after the race where she did so well. And if you think the $46,000 is nice, yeah, it is, but he's going to take her on the road, go up to New York, where already the Yankee-Southern rivalry thing is going on. These are the years before the Civil War, and of course, fashion is the big name up there in New York. Peytona comes up from Tennessee to beat her, and does. And wins $20,000 on top of that. In 2 races, that horse got him $66,000. As I said, we're talking at a time when Sumner County not only led the country in horse flesh and horse breeding, it also led the world in a lot of ways. Now, sadly, it's a tumble downhill from that point forward. Why did the horse racing decline in the area? That's a multifaceted question. There's a lot of reasons. The one for years, I guess to make us feel better, that we used to say was the Civil War. The Army came in and they just bred out the good blood, and their Army horses just ruined the stock forever. Nonsense. They're still raising and breeding horses into the 1880s and 90s. In fact, Nashville gets another horse track in 1887. No, the horse flesh is still there. It's just the finances took a hit. And that lifestyle, those huge planters, and more importantly, the slavery that ran it, was gone at that point. And so the glory days for this sort of thing was over. Also, kind of a new definition of what is a gentleman at that point in time. In the Old South, it was almost medieval. After that, it's more industrialists and people who are investing on Wall Street. That's your new people. So it becomes a kind of an equal opportunity thing. A guy in San Francisco couldn't be equal to a fellow up here in New York by just investing in the horse flesh. And that's where you start seeing it almost at an arm's distance, where it's not the owner of the horse literally hands-on mixing bloodlines and trying to get the perfect racer. It's more like, I bought the horse, I've also paid a bunch of guys to take care of it for me. And that's kind of the model that you sometimes see today. It's an investment after the Civil War. You also don't see it the same egos, in a way. Those early tracks, I mean, you put a pistol in Jackson's hand, it's the same thing. You'll fight a duel, you'll fight a horse race with somebody. It's that personal level of animosity and this pride riding on the horse. You don't really see it so much after that. So the culture shifts, obviously. But also morals are rising, or what we say are morals. And in 1906, as I pointed out, the anti-betting law came in, and that pretty much put paid to the industry. Now there's some talk today about bringing it back. I don't know if they ever will or not. I know they'll have an uphill battle to ever get the horse flesh back the way it was. But at one point in time, you're standing in a place that was nationally known as one of the greatest centers of this sport at a time when only the elite practiced it. And it's maybe a footnote in the county's history, but a fascinating one at that as well. So Sumner County, by the way, taken in the 1930s right there. I forget the name of the horse. Oh, gosh. I didn't write her down. Or him down, sorry. Oh, I didn't write him down. But this is, again, one of those prized racers that was still being raised in the 1930s. Of course, we get today the steeplechase out of this and what have you, but it seems like once you take the betting and the crowd and the screaming people out of it, it kind of loses something along the way. So it's an interesting journey, and it's amazing to see how much this was tied into the story of Tennessee, the story of Andrew Jackson, and to see that if nothing else, if anybody comes up here talking big about Nashville, you can always look them in the eye and say, well, let me tell you that story about Andrew Jackson and the one time he was actually beaten and admitted it. So Sumner County has a proud legacy here, and it was fascinating to go through this and actually get more acquainted and realize how much in the blood this used to be in this place. On a personal level, it's fascinating for me just because my great-grandfather was a horse breeder in Ireland. And he said he sold to the Vanderbilts, he sold to West Point, did a lot of business in this side of the pond. The only place he wouldn't sell to was the Tennessee Walking Horse Association, but everybody else was fair game. So for me, it's part of my legacy, it's part of my family story, and it's part of the place I live. And just goes to show you that the most interesting stories are sometimes hidden right where you're not going to be looking for them. So I hope you've enjoyed my little brief, informal look at horse racing in this area. But yes, ma'am.
Why was it back then it was the mares and the fillies that were so prized and not the stallions? I don't know, I can't explain it, and I've talked to a couple of horse breeders that have come through the program at the Hermitage, and I don't know that there is an explanation, but the mares generally tended to be the better runners in those days, and they lasted longer for whatever reason. Same reason we asked them why 3 or 4 years old? Why is that the peak? Just seems to be they're young enough to still run, but they're old enough not to be young and dumb, and they had to have their head about them at that point. So it's really more tradition than anything else. But for some reason, in that case, I don't know if there's a scientific explanation for it or not, but the mares tended to be the better runners, and some of the greatest champions were mares in those days. That's why most of the horses in Churchill Downs and Keeneland and Lexington are the male.
Yeah, and yet in those days, it was the females that were the better runners, which is what we used to love doing it, because one of the people doing the program, she used to talk about that and talk about how he couldn't beat this little mare out of Sumner County, and she would always add girl power at the end of that, which I thought was cute. But, and again, it all gets down culturally to the way it changed. We kind of unkindly behind the scenes called it the whiteout that happened in the 1920s. Because up until then, in 1887, I think it was, out of the, how many, was it 12 horses that ran the 1887 Kentucky Derby? And I think 8 of the jockeys were African American. I mean, it was a huge, and the greatest trainers in America at that point. William Alexander bought himself out of slavery with the proceeds he made from training horses, and was actually purchased, his services were purchased by Andrew Jackson, hired, not him purchased. He hired William Alexander to come down here and train his horses at one point, and then got mad because there's letters about him where nobody's lining up to take Jackson's offer of stud out. They all want William Alexander's horse, which is stabled at the Hermitage. And he's like, can't he move to another place so I can get some business coming in here? So it's funny to see at that point, it was a strange kind of equality. You see it on a very basic level with Simon, where he can get away with murder and hire himself. There's one point, the thing about Simon that I found fascinating was he was owned as property, but he was owned by 2 minor children. They hadn't come yet of age. So the estate was being administered by, in trust for these 2 kids. So basically they didn't know what to do with Simon. He was disabled, obviously. He wouldn't be useful in the fields and everything. They just kind of let him go to his own devices. So what he would do is he'd go down to the Edgefield area, right across the river from Nashville, and hire himself out. He was still owned, but he would contract as a laborer. And on one occasion, Thomas Claiborne, the administrator of the estate, thought he was going to save Simon from himself and went riding down there. And when George Eliot tried to hire him, as he normally did, as a rider for one of his horses, he started outbidding him. And he usually got, I think it was $20 a year to do the jockeying right there. Well, Claiborne took it up to about 40, and he finally turned around and said, basically, leave it alone. I'm not selling myself. I'm just trying to get hired here. And Thomas Claiborne took the hint, but he was hired $40 a year for that one because Elliott wanted him and said, no, I'm going to outbid you, and took him in. So it's a remarkable story for a man who's in slavery, but at the same time, he's almost an entrepreneur. He's got a way to work around the system and able to get a little more freedom than most of the people around him. Now that story gets written out of the record. And by the 1920s, they're all white in the jockeys. The jockeys, the trainers, everybody who has any money in this, it all becomes that way. And you're not going to see another actual African-American jockey in this country until, I want to say, 1969. Was that right? I think. No, excuse me. That was the first female jockey. It was 1969. You're going to see African-American jockeys in the 1980s again. Literally 100 years after that. So, it's an interesting story from that standpoint too, to see how many of these stories were forgotten over the years and how much, how complex and vibrant a world it really was once you scratch away some of the surface there. Yep.
Did you get into the St. Blaise era, or is that past where you?
That was past where we stopped. We stopped with the Civil War basically because at that point, with Jackson's death in 1845, it was really, that's the main thrust of the story. A little bit of familiarity, but not a lot past that, just because that's where we were taking the story. And for me, it turned out, in a way, it was better that way because that era, the post-Civil War era, is actually a lot better documented than the era we're talking about here. I mean, Simon was semi-legendary in his day, but he disappears from the record very quickly. Even by the time Bailey Peyton was writing about him in the 1870s, he says that he died some years ago. Well, he died 40 years ago. we were looking in the 1870s saying, we must have died somewhere around here. No, we finally found the newspaper thing, and it turned out he'd been dead for 40 years, and Peyton never got the memo on that. So again, it was kind of an ill-documented era, and so much of it is bloodlines and pedigrees. And that's why my eyes always glazed over. I didn't want to get into this because it was like, oh, I've got to know about Dyer and Sam or Dam and Sire and who was, and I mean, these records go back to the 1600s, and you've got to have that unbroken pedigree, and it's just like, it reads like a medieval titles list. It's like a biblical verse with all the who begot who going all the way down. That's part of it, and it's amazing the records that they kept on those things. But at the same time, the human side of it really hadn't been looked into that much. And we had the whole office of the Hermitage saying, did you know that this happened? All these people who worked there for 40 years said, I had no idea. So for me, that was kind of our job in doing this, is to try to bring those lives back in. And we didn't have enough time to actually get in past Jackson's lifetime. Yes?
Did you say that there was a house, I don't know, on Red River Road where they're still here?
I did indeed. If you go out the Red River Road, just past the bridge, as you're coming out of downtown, on the left-hand side, in fact, I didn't put it in the thing. I got a picture of it off of Google Views. That was Colonel George Elliott's home. And what's that? That's it, right there. Actually, that is where Pacolet died. In the summer of 1829, Elliott boarded Pacolet, the horse that Jackson put so much money in to beat Haney's Mariah. Shows you, these guys didn't hold a grudge. They were all buddy-buddy.
Of course, James David Sanderson wrote Making American Thoroughbred, and that's where the interview with Colonel Greenberry Williams is recorded by Bailey Peyton, and we did him in the cemetery tour at Greenberry Williams Saturday.
Yep.
We did him in the cemetery tour.
There we go. Greenberry Williams.
He was the main one.
He was.
And he outlived everybody. He did it for 70 years.
Yeah. In fact, if you want to know this subject, the best source in the world, or there's two sources actually, and it's from the same fellows, read Bailey Peyton's memoirs that he wrote. He wrote them twice, once for the, what magazine was that? Luckily they're available online. He wrote a version in the 1860s maybe, late 60s, that was published around 1876, and then after his death in 1916, another version of it was published in a book called The Creation of the American Thoroughbred, with special emphasis on Tennessee. I don't know exactly the title on that. Both these are available online, and Greenberry Williams is his main source of information. Yeah. I mean, he's a very old man at that point in time. He's practically blind.
He was 95 when he interviewed him.
And that's the thing about Peyton was he's the accidental historian. I don't think he knew how valuable these stories were going to be. He was writing it for the sporting crowd, and he'd just write these cute little anecdotes for the people. And you go back and look at him, and the man was an amazing chronicler. He'd listen to anything. He was always at the right place, the right time. He said when he was in Washington with Jackson, that was the thing, was if you wanted to get Jackson to talk, start bringing up a horse race, start bringing up Haney's Mariah. Oh boy, he was off and running. And it was just, you couldn't get him to shut up half the time. One of the things we found hilarious about Jackson was he tries to bring it into the White House with him, and he's almost subversive about it. This is how much, we used to joke that this guy's like a football fanatic. He's the way we used to put it was, have you ever seen that guy at the wedding who's checking the football scores on his phone? That's Jackson with horse racing. So he leaves it at arm's length when he goes to Washington, but he's immediately writing back and saying, so what's the bloodlines looking like? I go, well, what's coming up at the fall races? So let me know who to back and what to go. And so by 1829, when he's, or excuse me, 1832, when he's starting to get into, running for the second term and everything, he's actually got plans to ship horses, 16 horses, quietly from the Hermitage to Washington City, and to expand the stables at the White House, and he got Congress to appropriate the money to do it, without telling them why he wanted them expanded. So he's getting all this done very quietly, and it's one of the very few times I've ever seen this happen, and it's very amusing. His Secretary of War, John Eaton, walks in and basically hits the panic button and says, in private correspondence, they've already got so many scandals on this guy, he doesn't need to be the horse racing president. We don't need that as well, the gambling president. So without telling Jackson, he writes back to the Hermitage and says, nix the order, send the horses back, don't send them to Washington. So Jackson's literally looking at his watch saying, so when are the horses coming? And this goes on for a few weeks until he realizes somebody, that he writes back and gets well, Eaton told us to, he hit the ceiling, and he is just livid that somebody went behind his back and he orders the horses up. They're finally sent up there, and absolutely nothing comes of it. He very quietly, he gets his nephew to be his front man. Andrew Jackson Donaldson. So it's not exactly the best plan I've ever seen, but he quietly takes the horses to Baltimore and Washington, and Jackson, through the middleman, is betting on the horses the whole time.
Andrew Jackson Donaldson's letters from that
time? Yes. They are entertaining.
So they're full of those horses.
Oh, yeah. He nearly ran over Martin Van Buren one time on the racetrack. I mean, there's a lot of fun things that were going on, but it's central to Jackson. In the middle of all of the bank scandals and the wars and everything, you can get him off and running on the horses, and it's just in his blood to almost to the day he dies. And Peyton is that wonderful fellow. The other story about Peyton, by the way, he's the only guy who ever had the guts to do that. He asked him, again, tied into the horse racing, killed Charles Dickinson in 1806. And it's confusing, but it was because of a horse race, and the opponent, which was, it was Truxton, and it was Plowboy was the other one, which came up lame, and they had to pay the forfeit. There was an argument over the payment of the forfeit. Boys started gossiping, and the next thing you know, he and Charles Dickinson have challenged each other. They're going to go kill each other. And he got shot and killed Dickinson in the duel. Years later, 1845, Jackson is dying at this point. He's maybe 6 weeks away from dying. And they've carried him out to the garden in the Hermitage to get some sun, and Bailey Peyton, as always, has come over and just sitting with him, as he always did. And he said, at that point, for the first time, I felt comfortable enough to ask him about the duel. So he said, General, what can you tell me about Charles Dickinson? And he said he could barely lift his head anymore, but he said the old fire came back into his eyes. He lifted his head off the mattress, looked me in the eye, and said, if he had shot me through the heart, I would have stood long enough to kill him. And he said he put his head right back down, and that was it. So, again, like I said, he wasn't one to give up easily on a grudge. So he hadn't forgiven Haney's Mariah, and he hadn't forgiven Charles Dickinson. Those are the only two he never did forgive on his deathbed. So that's kind of, any other questions on anything? Sorry I came in so haphazard, and sorry if this is a little haphazard myself, but I'm still a little wiped out from the road, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you want to know more, stop by the Hermitage, and I think they may be stopping the program we put together at the end of this month. I think that's right. But it'll be probably picking up in the spring again, and if you ask some lovely people on staff out there about some of this research and some of these lesser-known stories about this thing, in particular about Sumner County, just ask Haney's Mariah. Just tell them Haney's Mariah sent you, and like me, they'll be off and running.
Brian, do you have some books?
I do have some books. They don't have to do with horse racing. I brought some of my notorious Nashville books, and if you do want to buy a copy, they're $20 tonight. I have to take checks or cash. I don't have one of those those fancy things they have in Star Trek. I don't have those. So, but if you have, if you want to purchase one, I'll definitely buy it. I will sign it, but I'll have to.
Tell them about one of the stories in there, Gallatin story.
Oh, yes, there is a wonderful Gallatin story in there. I cannot give you a spoiler, I won't give you a spoiler on this, but I did cover the story of Anna Dotson, which some of you may be familiar with. In 1913, she had a little brouhaha with her boyfriend in a barbershop in downtown Nashville, and she ended up getting quite an eyebrow-raising sentence from the jury at her murder trial later that year. So it's a fascinating story, and she was probably featured in the cemetery, was she? Or
She had been several times, and the first time, the actress, the first time around, of course, they did it about 45 times, first time around, she had the gun and the muff, and she pulled it out, bang! Scared everybody to death in the cemetery.
That's almost what happened. And it was quick on the trigger.
Yeah.
Incidentally, by the way, and I am proud of this right there, I went through the papers. There's only 2 pictures of Anna that I was ever able to find, but I was able to print them. Where is it? It is my favorite chapter in the book, I have to say. It was fun to write. There's this one, which is hilarious because this was taken outside the court as she's wearing, that's the muff. That's her in her, she was just arraigned for murder, her husband's taking her out, yeah.
Yeah.
And basically, I'm going to come around and just kind of show you.
That's the new book.
Yeah, this is the new one here, and you can see that thing. It's an awful photograph because her attorney bashed the photographer over the head when he snapped his Kodak with his umbrella and said, basically right off. So they guarded her, she was society up here, they guarded her identity very, very well. So what they did was they had the cartoonist from the paper sneak into the courtroom while she was on the stand and sketch her. That's Anna Dotson, on trial for murder in 1913. So that was just a remarkable find for me to actually get to see her face for the first
Yeah,
time.
that was in the newspaper.
Yeah, and that was actually taken surreptitiously without her knowing about it, so. But it's, basically, I will say this, I've written 2 books, and I kept the good stories for this one, which you're not supposed to do, because it's kind of egotistical to say maybe they'll come back and give you another book deal. But Jesse James, John Dillinger, The Wild Bunch, I kept them for this one. So I can say, it definitely covers ground that the first one didn't cover, so it's worth a look. And if you don't want to get one tonight, it's on Amazon, the usual suspects, all of that. So. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm sorry I'm so...